Welcome to another episode of This Month in Mormon Studies, your monthly recap of news, blogs, book releases, and events in the field of Mormon studies. This show is sponsored by Kofford Books and the Mormon News Report, and co-hosted by Brian Whitney and the genial rapscallion, Brandt Malone.
We're breaking the big words out early. Nice to be with you, Brian. Just a quick announcement. I know the Mormon News Report is taking a bit of a hiatus. The Mormon News Report will be coming back after General Conference weekend, so that following Monday. If you'd like more information, go to Twitter and go to @TheMormonNews, and you'll see a pin up at the top. You can sign up for the daily newsletter, and we should have that out. So then it could be official that, yes, the Mormon News Report is sponsoring this podcast.
Well, we never lost the sponsorship of the Mormon News Report. It just lost its own momentum for a little while, right?
I took a sabbatical. How's that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I expect big news after General Conference.
Oh, yeah. It always is.
Always is. All right. Well, speaking of big news, we have a big show lined up. We have an action-packed, full roster of things to discuss from the month of March. Do we not?
We do. So let's get into it. What do you say?
Let's do it.
Okay. Dr. Robert A. Reese was appointed Director of Mormon Studies at the Graduate Theological Union. Dr. Reese has taught at UCLA, UC Santa Cruz, and UC Berkeley, and was the Fulbright Professor of American Studies at Vytautas Magnus University in Lithuania. I hope I got that right.
I'm sure they'll forgive us.
Yeah. Reese has taught classes in Mormon Studies at the Theological Union since 2010 and has published widely on Mormon and religious studies. Bob is also a key member of the Bay Area Mormon Studies Council, which is working with the Theological Union and the wider Mormon community to establish an academic chair in Mormon Studies at the Theological Union.
You know, I'm thrilled that there's another chair for Mormon studies. The more universities that we get on board with having Mormon studies programs, the better that it's going to be for all of us who religiously follow Mormon studies, to use a bad pun.
Absolutely. And yes, that was a very bad pun.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm the king of bad puns. Some great news coming out from our Midwestern cousins in the Community of Christ. They've announced an expansion to their history department, naming 3 new World Church historians. They are David Howlett of Saratoga Springs, New York, Barbara Walden of Hartford, Connecticut, and Ron Romig of Independence, Missouri. They will serve as part of a church history and sacred story team led by Apostle Lachlan Mackay. The goal of this team is to engage the church in exploring its sacred story in responsible ways that inform and encourage its mission. I know all 3 of these new appointees, and they're all very well credentialed historians. They've published before. They've published books together before, in fact, and very active in the Community of Christ's historical community. They're going to be fantastic in this task, and I love that they're expanding on their history department and recognizing the role that history plays within their religious tradition.
And especially with that being led by Lachlan, I mean, everybody that I know that has met Lach has had nothing but positive things to say, both on a personal and on a professional level with him. So it just seems like a huge win for the Community of Christ.
Yeah, they couldn't have picked a better leader for this. Lachlan was the historic sites director in both Kirtland for the Kirtland Temple as well as Nauvoo. In fact, he still lives in Nauvoo with his wife.
So the academic hits keep on coming. Joseph M. Spencer was selected as the next editor of the Neil A. Maxwell Journal of Book of Mormon Studies on March 10. Spencer's appointment comes on the editorship heels of Brian M. Hoglid, where Spencer served as an associate editor in addition to contributing articles, co-editing the Institute's Groundwork book series, and co-directing the annual Mormon Theology Seminar. Spencer's 3-year appointment begins on June 1st, when he will begin preparing Volume 27, Spring 2018, of the journal.
Some news on the George Q. Cannon Journal's digitization project from the Church Historians Press, or I should say at least sort of news. It appeared as of last week that they had completed the final journals, which would run from 1881 until 1901 when Cannon died. However, it appears that this was inadvertent. According to contact that I spoke with the Church Historians Press, the final journals are still in the pre-production phase and will be released in sections over the next 3 to 5 months. It sounds like someone just got a little trigger happy with that upload button.
And this is a big deal from what I understand. The George Q. Cannon journals are something they've been working on for a long time. And once they finally get it done, that's going to be kind of a momentous event for them to say, yes, now we've got all this available, right?
Yeah, and the closer that we get to the turn of the 20th century, the more light that will shed on that period. Cannon was very involved during the time when we had the anti-polygamy crusades in Utah. He was involved with politics, and he wrote everything down. So, getting that final chunk of journals will be extremely beneficial for primary source research. But yeah, I mean, there were a number of people within the historical community that posted as soon as they were up. And they were kind of taken aback as soon as they were taken back down. And, you know, and to be fair, in this day of expectation of transparency, there's always going to be some questions as to why they were taken down. What are they hiding? Stuff, you know, nonsense like that. But I think in this case, we can clearly place the blame on an intern.
We always blame the interns. March saw the 175th anniversary of the LDS Articles of Faith. In 1842, Boston lawyer George Barstow asked friend John Wentworth, owner and editor of the weekly Chicago Democrat, to write Joseph Smith requesting a summary of Mormon doctrines and history. Joseph obliged with the simple request that the letter be published, quote, entire, ungarnished, and without misrepresentation. Barstow sought the information about the Mormons for possible inclusion in a book about the history of New Hampshire. However, Barstow decided to make 1819 the closing date of his study and not include the Mormons, who organized as a church in 1830. The Mormon Newsroom linked to the original Wentworth letter, which is available on the Joseph Smith Papers Project website.
Yeah, all I can say is editors, right?
I know.
Former assistant church historian Richard Turley was honored by the Mormon Historic Sites Foundation with its Junius F. Wells Award. This award recognizes individuals who have given extraordinary service in the preservation of Mormon history. Past presidents include President Gordon B. Hinckley, Elder M. Russell Ballard, and of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, and Elder Marlon K. Jensen, Emeritus General Authority 70. An interesting fact, Turley was appointed to the Church History Department in late 1985 at the young age of 29. This was just 3 months after the Mark Hoffman bombings.
And Richard Turley is another one of those guys that, at least within the historical community, seems like he has a lot of respect, and it seems like it's a well-deserving award.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and he was a practicing lawyer before being appointed over to the Church History Department. And one of the very first things that he did was publish on Mark Hoffman, one of the earliest books that came out on the Mark Hoffman case.
So, Signature Books has been very busy lately. Over the last few months, Jason Francis and John Colthar prepared and uploaded over 42,000 pages of periodicals and newspapers to their page on archive.org, where they're available to view and download for free. The titles include familiar favorites like The Times and Seasons, which ran from 1839 to 1846, and the Nauvoo Expositor, the single issue, two more obscure periodicals like Der Darsteller. My German is horrible.
Yeah, that was the German publication.
Yep. And even some more recent periodicals like the Seventh East Press, which ran from 1981 to 1983. Each of the 54 newspapers available on the Signature Books archive page exist in their entirety. And for someone like me who is a document hoarder, especially an electronic document hoarder, this is like, I just had a field day, just grabbing everything I could.
You know, I don't know if you noticed when you were in there, but did they have the Valley Tan newspaper?
I didn't look particularly careful, so I don't know.
Yeah. That was always one of my favorite ones. The Valley Tan newspaper was created by some rather antagonistic Gentiles in the mid 1850s Utah period. Valley Tan was actually the name of an alcoholic beverage, right? That they named it after. It was the alcoholic beverage that was the most well known in Utah, and it was the only alcoholic beverage that Mark Twain ever made a comment on. Look it up. Mark Twain's quote on it is hilarious. I don't want to give away the punchline, but just Google Mark Twain plus Valley Tan, and you'll have yourself a good laugh.
There you go.
A resource that may be useful for the chapel or teaching in Sunday school, the Joseph Smith Papers has published an index on their website that provides the primary sources for the quotes found in Joseph Fielding Smith's 1938 book, Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith. From the Joseph Smith Papers website, Joseph Fielding Smith's compilation was, in many ways, a predecessor to the Joseph Smith Papers project, an early attempt to gather the writings and words of the founder and first prophet of the Latter-day Saint Church. Because Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith was based on secondary sources, in fact, he used the B.H. Roberts History of the Church for all of his sources, it is considered an outdated source for scholarly use, but because it remains popular and accessible, Joseph Smith Papers has published on their website an index linking quotations to the original texts of Joseph Smith's words. And they did note on there that there's some differences between what B.H. Roberts had put in History of the Church that Joseph Fielding Smith ended up collecting for his 1938 book and what the original documents say. So this is one of those areas where you have an opportunity now to check before you either publish something or before you put it in your church talk.
Well, and credit where credit's due to them. I mean, this seems like a logical step, but I think it's also a big step because that book has had so much tradition within the LDS Church. Like you said, it's been around since 1938. And And so to be in a situation where you might be looking at the book versus the primary source documentation and seeing differences, that's difficult for some people. So credit to them where they're actually saying, okay, we're going to put this out there.
Should we move on to the blogs?
Let's do it.
All right. Ben Park posted on his own blog an interesting entry titled William Law's Amazing and Suspect Diary, where he looked at Lyndon Cook's 1994 biography of William Law that included among its primary sources the suspect Law's recording of doings at Nauvoo in 1844. Park wrote, entries from later months offer a first-hand view of Nauvoo's roller coaster ride, giving tantalizing details about schemes, confrontations, and even death threats. It almost seems too good to be true, and in fact, there are some reasons to believe that may very well be the case. No Mormon scholar currently has seen the actual manuscript. Word is that Cook got access to a manuscript via the family and never saw the actual holograph. In fact, this collection has yet to surface. While Park doesn't go so far as to label it as a forgery, he does question the document's trustworthiness. It's a fascinating bit of documentary detective work that Ben has done here, and something that true history nerds will enjoy.
Oh, that is like, for real history nerds, that's like juicy, and right. they've got the transcript, but they don't have the holograph. Oh, what's next?
Exactly. I mean, this could become a movie starring Nicolas Cage.
Andrew Hamilton has a guest post at Keep Up Pitchin' and looking at the then titled Young Women's Mutual Improvement Association President Florence Smith Jacobson and, quote, one rather unusual incident that occurred between her and President Henry D. Moyle, first counselor in the Young Women's presidency. President Jacobson led a productive church career, and after her tenure in the Young Women's MIA, she was called by President Harold B. Lee to be the church curator. One of her assignments was restoring the Lion and Beehive houses, important projects to Jacobson, as her grandfather Joseph F. Smith lived in the Beehive house, and the Lion house was used to house young women as they attended college in Salt Lake City. President Moyle, however, was very different in his views of preserving old buildings of historical incident, with his biography stating he had, quote, little empathy for the cause of historians and preservationists. President Moyle made an offhand remark that if the Beehive House and the Lion House were taken down, a good building could be put on the site. Greg Prince, while working on his biography of David O. McKay, interviewed Florence and Ted Jacobson. Hamilton writes, after becoming the Young Woman president, Sister Jacobson put together a proposal for the restoration of the Lion House. She was told to President Moyle. Speaking of this meeting, Sister Jacobson told Prince that, quote, I was appointed to go and see not President McKay, but Henry D. Moyle, who was a counselor. And Brother Moyle just said, no way. We're going to tear that house down for a driveway from the parking lot underneath. The high-rise parking lot. I know, this is like, you want to talk about juicy drama.
Yeah.
He said, that's all planned, Florence. That house is going to go down. I said, President Moyle, you just can't do that. And he said, Florence, all it does is remind people of polygamy. I said, well, I'm not ashamed of it. Are you? And he said, that's not a fair question. I said, it's fair in my book, but he was just adamant that the house was going to go down. Well, about 5 months later, he was gone. He died. After President Moyle's death, President Jacobson tried again, this time going straight to President McKay. She proposed to President McKay that they preserve and convert the Lion House into its present form as a restaurant and banquet hall. She told him that, quote, we'll maintain the standards of the church. There will be no smoking or drinking. We won't serve coffee. We'll just do what we should do, and it will be a beautiful center, and it will be wonderful for the weddings. She reported that President McKay looked up at his counselors, and he said, brethren, I'm all for it. Will you sustain me in this? President Tanner was a little reluctant. He said, I just think we're preserving too many old buildings. But despite some concerns from President Tanner, President Jacobson had the most important supporter necessary at this time, President David O. McKay. The project was approved, the Lion House was preserved, and within a few years, the church's monetary investment in that building had been returned. And as a quick aside, if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have some of the best rolls ever on the face of the earth.
Yeah, those Lion House rolls are amazing. But I have two quick additions to this. Number one, I'm sure that when President McKay was informed that they wouldn't be serving coffee there, he probably responded back and said, but what about my Coke? Right?
Yes, very important things.
Very important things. Number two, I think that President Moyle, or was he President Moyle at the time?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. I don't think that Moyle really had anything to worry about because last time that I took a tour there, the last thing that you'll be educated on is the history of polygamy.
Oh, yeah. They're not going to want to touch that at all.
No, let's just say that they like their quaint stories and material history there. Mm-hmm. That was an intriguing story, by the way, Brandt. We've got some good drama in this show.
This is a great episode so far.
Yeah. I hope that our listeners feel that way. So moving on, the winner of the most provocative blog title this month goes to Eugenics and the Intellectual Underpinnings of Mormonism in the Alt-Right by Joseph. Yeah, right. By Joseph Stewart, posted on Juvenile Instructor. In this post, Stewart discusses a recent viral Twitter sensation, and I'm sure that you know who I'm talking about. Openly white supremacist Mormon woman who goes by the name A Purposeful Wife. I don't want to give her too much publicity, but while Stewart completely rejects the rhetoric that this woman is spewing, he is fascinated by the historical intersections between Mormonism and early 20th century scientific racism, in particular the practice of eugenics or selective breeding, for those who don't know that term, particularly as a means of maintaining racial purity. Stewart wrote, after the LDS Church abandoned plural marriage, Mormons worked to be considered, quote, the right type of citizen through appeals to whiteness, including eugenics. A few examples include articles in the Relief Society magazine, which warned its female readers against race suicide, meaning the lessening of the white race's power in the face of non-white immigration to the United States. Also, in 1927, Apostle Melvin J. Ballard proudly quoted a scientist that labeled Mormonism, quote, the most eugenical religion in the world. Yeah, it's a fascinating, if not discomforting, historical topic that I think leaves a lot of room to be done on it. We don't look at this issue much. Really, Joseph is one of the few people that I know that's digging into this topic. But wow, right?
And you know, the interesting thing is it is still there to a small extent, but a lot of people don't want to talk about it because, you know, like you said, there was a lot of that stuff that is holdovers from earlier days. And so I think the fact that Joseph's willing to kind of dive down into a lot of that uncomfortable stuff, that made for just a really great article. And I was really impressed with how he did it, and particularly how he stayed away from the individual that was involved. I'll put it that way. So, Brian, do you know the key to a good blog post?
I don't. Inform me.
Relevance and buzzwords mixed with quality scholarly analysis, kind of like what Christopher at the Juvenile Instructor did in his latest post. So he hits all three of those notes, looking at the relevance of fake news to the beginning of Mormonism, looking at Mormon leaks, and bringing up an incident that I really didn't know about: Abner Cole, the Reflector periodical, and leaking the first page of the Book of Mormon. Christopher writes, much like whistleblowers and WikiLeakers today, Cole claimed the moral high ground in leaking documents and names. After publishing the first in a series of 3 excerpts from the Book of Mormon, he explained that the book, when it shall come before the public, must stand or fall according to the whims and fancies of its readers. He was thus merely assisting his neighbors in their pursuit of truth. To those who profess liberal principles and objected to the ethics of publishing the material before the book's release, Cole assured them that there did not appear to be anything treasonable or which would have a tendency to subvert our liberties within the book's pages. In revealing Howard's supposed spiritual duplicity, Cole protested that he was merely gratifying the man's own wishes to appear in print. In response to legal threats from Joseph Smith and a near fistfight between the two men, Cole backed down and stopped publishing pirated excerpts before the end of January. But as Christopher notes, Cole wasn't done, something he'll get into in the final installment of the series. How about that for a cliffhanger?
Oh, man, he knows what he's doing, doesn't he?
He does. It's pretty good.
You know, so I know a little bit about this story. Garrick Dirtmack actually did a presentation on this at the last John Whitmer Historical Association conference. And couple of interesting things about Abner Cole. He was using the same printing press that Joseph was. So that's how he got access to this material. He'd go in there at night and he would see the sheets hanging of the Book of Mormon printing manuscript hanging, and he would just feel at liberty to just publish some in his own newspaper. And the other thing too is that that wasn't really that uncommon of a practice at that time. It was people didn't have the same feelings over copyright and over your intellectual property rights as they do now. It wasn't as strongly emphasized or legally enforced or whatever. So I mean, it's funny to me that we've had leaks out since, but even before the church was officially organized, right?
And additionally, I think their emphasis was more on the moral rightness of something happening versus, like you said, the intellectual copyright or whatever. Like, they were more concerned of, no, we got to make sure that everything's okay and we're going to give people the right way to view this stuff.
Right. Jonathan Stapley posted at the Juvenile Instructor a piece titled "Finding a Story or How To," where he discusses fishing in digital collections with no particular aim in mind than to just hopefully wander upon an interesting item or a topic. In this article, Stapley uses his example, a personal history that he discovered, published in 1959 and written by Mary Velati Lee Romney. What a Mormon name.
Well.
What was particularly interesting about this account was that Mary had received a blessing by other women prior to giving birth at her home. And again, this is something that's published, in 1959. So I think that this blessing took place in the 1920s. Stapley commented that there's still a lot to unpack with this particular story, but, he made a solid point of the power of just randomly surfing, even in the digital archive. So, if you are, at work and you're bored and you decide to just start surfing digital archives, you're actually probably, you can count that as productivity.
Yeah, I'll try and use that in my next annual review. Stan Spencer has a thought-provoking paper at The Interpreter titled Seers and Stones, the Translation of the Book of Mormon as Divine Visions of an Old-Time Seer. This paper was 45 pages long, so let me just give you a brief abstract. Joseph Smith used the term Urim and Thummim to refer to a pair of seer stones or interpreters he obtained for translating the Book of Mormon, as well as to other seer stones he used in a similar manner. By what property or principle these stones enabled Joseph to see the translated text has long been a matter of conjecture among Mormons, but the stones have commonly been understood as divinely powered devices analogous to the latest human communications technology. An alternative view presented here is that the stones had no technological function, but simply served as aids to faith. In this view, the stones did not themselves translate or display text. They simply inspired the faith Joseph Smith needed to see imaginative visions, and in those visions, he saw the text of the Book of Mormon, just as Lehi and other ancient seers saw sacred text in vision. Although Joseph Smith also saw visions without the use of the stones, the logistics of dictating a book required the ability to see the translated text at will, and that was what the faith eliciting stones would have made possible. It's, there's a lot out there on the stones, and especially now that we're going down this road of actually seeing the seer stones like we saw last year, a very interesting way to look at it. I'll put it that way.
And from what I always understood, the stones would only allow him to see 113 characters at a time. Is that?
Yeah.
Something like that.
I mean, Twitter is prophetic. I'll put it that way.
But on a serious note, though, I'm glad that we're starting to get to a point that even within more traditional faith communities, they're starting to become more open to the idea of Joseph himself being more of a vision inspiration process of translating the Book of Mormon rather than it having to be a tight word for word translation. So I'm glad this conversation is going on. A video has been posted on the Mormon Interpreter site from Royal Skousen and Stan Carmack's 2016 Fair Mormon presentation titled Finishing Up the Book of Mormon Critical Text Project, an Introduction to the History of the Text of Book of Mormon. This project has been going on literally forever. I think probably since before the Book of Mormon was even translated, they were working on this. Those interested in this presentation can find the link in our show notes.
And Royal's been, like you said, he's been working on that forever. I want to say he's been working on that since, I don't know, he was a graduate student or something like that. Like, it's just been forever. Yeah.
And he went to school with Moses.
Yeah. Your friend and mine, Stephen Peck, has a video on the Mormon Interpreter website of a presentation he gave titled Why Evolution and LDS Thought Are Fully Compatible, Overcoming Our Suspicions of Science. This was given at the Science and Mormonism, Cosmos, Earth, and Man Symposium on November 9th, 2013, sponsored by the Interpreter Foundation, and you can find a link to that in the show notes.
David Evans over at Times and Seasons posted an interesting blog titled 3 Big Things and Some Little Things That This Lifelong Mormon Learned from Matt Bowman's History of the Church. If you're not familiar with that book, it's The Mormon People, The Makings of an American Faith. It came out during Mitt Romney's second campaign. This is something that Matt Bowman was actually approached by Penguin Press to put together and produce a comprehensive but yet very reader-friendly historical explanation of Mormonism. And I think he did a fantastic job. And I think that this is one of those books that I usually recommend reading first when people ask me what historical books do you recommend? Well, this lifelong Mormon, David Evans, decided to pick it up and take a look through it. And there were a number of things that really stood out to him. And this is somebody who is pretty comfortable with the history of the church and pretty well aware of the major historical events, at least. But few things that he highlighted was the power of the primary during the correlation reorganization of the 1960s. What a huge role they played in in the correlation efforts. Also, just the acceptance of Mormonism in American culture that didn't proceed in one obvious direction. So there's a lot of discussion in there about how Mormonism became accepted within mainstream American culture, and it isn't all based on Reed Smoot and those hearings, and then suddenly everybody's okay with Mormonism. Also, Bowman added some colorful and sobering anecdotes to the narrative of polygamy from the 1880s and the 1890s. So those are just a few of the things that Bowman treated in the book that really stood out to David Evans. He has a few other things that he mentioned in here. It's a really good article if you're interested in checking out this book, or if you haven't read it in a decade, I guess at this point. It's a good article to check out. We'll link it in the show notes.
And I'm with you, Brian. That's one of those books that I recommend to people if they say, okay, so where should I get started? That really is one of the first ones, just because it'll give you, it's not so much your typical narrative that you hear, but it really does give you a wide view of the history of Mormonism. And so even for lifelong members, like you were mentioning there, it's perfectly natural to start there, because you're going to find a lot of stuff. And Bowman does such a good job with adding sources to it that it gives you a lot of rabbit holes to go down.
Well, and it's terribly difficult to condense the history of the church down to a 300-page book, but yet Bowman managed to do it. So the only thing I really give him a little bit of heck for is his negligence in mentioning the Osmonds.
Although I will say this, if he does a second edition of the book, we better get a nice shout out in there.
Yeah, that and Napoleon Dynamite. He needs those two things in there because, he did bring it up to current history.
He did, yep.
Yeah. All right. So anyway, a little outside of the spectrum for Mormon studies, but a fascinating development for those who enjoy studying the formation of new religious movements. The followers of Denver Snuffer, I guess we're calling them Snufferites.
I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's possibly the coolest name for a Mormon schismatic group, right? Anyway, the followers of Denver Snuffer are canonizing his teachings as scripture to be added to the earlier editions of the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants that they adhere to. They're apparently doing this in a democratic fashion by allowing members to comment and weigh in on what should and should not be included. Other texts that they're going to follow include the 1840s version of the Doctrine and Covenants that would exclude revelations that were added later, such as D&C section 132, the revelation on plural marriage, which was not added until 1876. But they're also at the same time keeping things like the lectures on faith, which were also removed in that later 1876 edition. So it's really interesting to watch this group become a bona fide Mormon denomination of sorts. So this will become a historical study at some point, and we're watching it happen.
But despite the fact that Denver has repeatedly said, I'm not starting my own religion, I'm not going to be your prophet, et cetera, I will say there is a part of me, though, that says, all right, guys, go ahead and do this. And I will shamelessly buy it, mostly because I want to see how they're going to do it. I want to see if they can actually get it done. So, yeah,
right. How do you do this with somebody who doesn't claim to be the prophet? But, on the other hand, I guess Martin Luther, when he started breaking ways with the Catholic Church, he wasn't interested in starting his own church either. He just wanted to reform Catholicism. So I don't know. It's again, those who study new religious movements have all sorts of material here.
Absolutely. Yep. Rick Bennett, host of the Gospel Tangents podcast, which we'll talk about a little bit later, has a blog post up looking at one of the incidents brought up in his latest podcast, the vision of Elijah and the 40-year lag in its canonization. Rick talked to Dr. Richard Bennett, who called this a classic case in church history of what I would call the reclamation of revelation, and emphasized the importance of studying our history because, quote, sometimes we miss things. Knowing that even Joseph and Oliver, I mean, which is like...
what a wonderful explanation, right?
Yeah. Noting that even Joseph and Oliver didn't write down the vision of Elijah, it was Warren Cowdery. And it's not until Orson Pratt, who is one of his buddies, but him being Rick, it's not until Orson Pratt in 1876 says, we better get that down. He also talked with Dr. Mark Staker about some of the sticky problems that come about when studying church history, including the timing and authorization of the sealing authority and Joseph Smith's first plural wife.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting explanation. Sometimes we miss things. I'm not really sure where to take that, Brandt, other than saying that this is obviously a complicated story for good reason. The fact that it did take 40 years for somebody to canonize the event that we place a lot of weight on, particularly in comparing this to the Judaic tradition that Elijah would once again return to the earth. And we say this is when it happened. This definitely illustrates some of the problems that we have of historical recollection.
Well, and I think for a historian to say something like, sometimes we miss things. Like, I think historians would be comfortable in saying, like, yeah, that's the reason why we keep studying the same things, because sometimes we miss things. But for someone connected or with a connection to the LDS Church to say, hey, sometimes the LDS Church misses things in its history, that's kind of big. And it does open up the door to say, okay, so are we, I'm trying to figure out how to put this as neutral as possible, but the common narrative that we have, do we need to re-examine some of that because did we miss something?
Right. Well, I'll say that with the Community of Christ, they, in their Kirtland Temple tours, they've actually omitted discussing this because of that very reason, because the evidence is so far from being contemporary for it. So yeah. Okay. Well, speaking of shocking and scandalous news, let's just keep plowing down that road. It has been publicly revealed that the Gospel Topics Race and Priesthood essay, the one that has caused such a stir, was in fact written by none other than
drumroll,
Paul Reeve.
Hey,
is anybody shocked? Is anybody shocked? No, nobody's shocked at all. To be honest, and for those who don't know Paul Reeve, he's the author of Religion of Different Color. He's also, I think he's the chair of the Department of History at the University of Utah. If he's not, then he should be. He also has been heading up the Mormon Studies program there. He's very well beloved and well known within Mormon historical circles, and he's also just a great guy. I'll say that. He's just a great guy. But, to be honest, those of us who have been following along and paying attention, Paul has made this admission publicly several times. In fact, whenever he's asked if he was the author behind it, he's very open about it and says, yes, I did submit the original draft of it. And then it goes through its editing and chopping up and revision stages. And, and the original draft he submitted was 25 pages long. And
it was longer than that. It was 55.
55. Oh, see, him better than I do.
Yeah.
But it ended up getting chopped down to what we have now, which is, probably 4 or 5 pages worth of material.
Excluding footnotes. I think you're right. So in case we don't get to this a little bit later, Rick has been doing such a good job with the Gospel Tangents podcast. I really encourage everyone to listen to it, but what he does is he records the podcast and then he'll actually transcribe some of it and put it on the Wheat and Tares website, which is where we're getting the blog post from. And he does a great job talking about the process that Paul went through with this, specifically that it was 55 pages with footnotes. That got chopped down to about 8 pages with footnotes after it went through the correlation committee. And a lot of people have asked him, hey, so could we have the original 55-page version? He's working on a book right now that's going to cover like 1850s, the 1852 Utah legislative session, I think. And that's going to have a big chunk of that original race essay because, according to him, that's going to be a big linchpin in the way that Brigham Young and early Utah Mormons viewed race. And so that's why he's going to get there.
Great insight.
Rachel Hunt Steenblick, a PhD student in philosophy of religion and theology at Claremont Graduate University and co-editor of Mormon Feminism, Essential Writings, has a guest post at By Common Consent with her slightly fleshed out version of a sermon she gave in her ward about the 175th anniversary of the founding of the Relief Society. And then she said this, in a great example of how Mormon studies can be brought into the LDS chapel, quote, "To tell this story, I'm going to draw upon the original Nauvoo Relief Society Minute Book recorded by the first secretary, Eliza R. Snow, Daughters of My Kingdom, the history and work of the Relief Society, and the first 50 years of Relief Society, key documents in Latter-day Saint women's history, recently published by the Church Historians Press. This entire talk that they posted on By Common Consent was very moving, and I'm really jealous that I'm not a member of her ward. So definitely go check it out in the show notes."
I'm slow clapping for Rachel over here. This is exactly what we need. We need people who are willing to take some of these primary sources and introduce them into the chapel, right? Whether it's in sacrament meeting, whether it's Sunday school, whether it's you're a seminary teacher, the more original material, firsthand accounts, contemporary material that we can get in front of people that explain the story of Mormonism, the better it is for everybody. So great job, Rachel. You absolutely have my respect.
And additionally, just to add on to that, Brian, I think really the benefit of everything that the Church Historians Press, that the Church History Department, and the Joseph Smith Papers Project is doing, especially for more traditional Mormons, is all that stuff is now quote unquote kosher, because you can find it through official LDS channels versus, oh, hey, here's crazy Brother Brandt doing his weird thing with this weird book that he's reading. Like, I mean, like you said, that is a perfect example of how we should be utilizing this, and really making it. Her talk was just so inspirational and great, and I can't say enough good things about it.
And so many people are unaware that on LDS.org that there is a section called History that you can click on, and they have all sorts of wonderful articles and things put together. And in fact, even for this article, a great supplement to it is a write-up that who was it? It was James Goldberg did this write-up on about 5 people who helped found the Relief Society, people that we don't discuss very often. It's a fascinating story. So we'll go ahead and link that in the show notes as well. Now, moving on to podcasts, we're going to get back into Gospel Tangents podcast with Rick Bennett and talk about his interviews with Mark Staker for a moment. So for those who aren't familiar with Mark Staker, he's an anthropologist with the LDS Church Historic Sites Department, and he's also the author of the award-winning Hearken, O Ye People, the historical setting of Joseph Smith's Ohio Revelations. That's one of the few books that has won Best Book Award from both the Mormon History Association and the John Whitmer Historical Association. Well, this interview that he did with him, he was interviewed actually for several shows on topics regarding the Kirtland Bank, regarding Elijah's reported visit at the Kirtland Temple, which we've already discussed, as well as the purposes of the Kirtland Temple University. There's also videos available for these interviews. So like you said, he transcribes them, he releases them as podcast episodes, and he also has videos with them because he's interviewing these people live. So definitely check it out. This is a great podcast here. And it looks like he's actually been out for a little while, but this is the first time he's come up on my radar.
Yeah, so he's been doing it since February. He focused a lot on Black history. So he talked to Mark Blair Young. He talked to Paul Reeve and a few others. This month he's been focusing a lot on the Kirtland era. The other thing that he does too is if you want to buy a full transcript of his interview, you can buy it on Amazon for your Kindle. Because I've got a long history with Mormon podcasting for at least the last 7 years. It's always been interesting to see the evolution of it. And I still go through once a month and I do a search on Mormon podcasts. Rick's popped up and I couldn't have been happier and more impressed just because there's some good stuff out there, but they are relatively new to the scene. And I always want to support really good quality podcasters that are new to the scene. Yeah. So speaking of another good quality podcast, Christopher C. Smith was recently interviewed by Gina Colvin on A Thoughtful Faith podcast with his thoughts on Joseph Smith, 19th century political conundrums, the Book of Mormon, and antebellum America. Chris is not LDS, but he's been fascinated with the tradition since he dated the local Mormon bishop's daughter in high school. I think objective outsider views on Mormonisms are always fascinating. I think we could learn so much from them because they're not clouded with a lot of the same emotions and ties to it that either those who are raised in the faith or those who are disaffected from the faith feel. And Chris really is no exception. Just a great interview, and Gina's a great host as well.
Well, and to give a little bit of caution to anybody who might go in listening to this, Chris does stand on the side of believing Joseph Smith was a con artist. He's pretty open about that. He believes the Book of Mormon was fraudulent text. He's such a darn nice guy.
That's the problem. Time. Yeah. Like,
right? He's like, yeah. I think he's a con artist, but but I love you guys. Yeah. He's a postdoc fellow up at Utah State University. I adore him personally. And Chris, if you listen to this episode, I always throw my arms around you every chance I can get because you're just so darn lovable and squeezable. But that's just fair warning. If you go into this and you're expecting an analysis that's going to make you feel good about your faith, you're probably not going to get that. You're probably going to walk away saying, maybe he's got some points.
And to back Chris up, I mean, granted, he's got that different perspective, but he also doesn't come at it lightly. Like he knows his stuff. I mean, and I think that's one of the best parts is you can have people who view the same information, highly intelligent, accomplished people, and can come up with different perspectives.
Right. Nick Gallietti, one of the hosts of the LDS Perspectives podcast, has been doing a series titled Revelations in Context, which ties right into that essay series by the LDS Church History Department. We've discussed the book that the Church History Department published earlier in the year under the same title, Revelations in Context. So he's been going through and interviewing the authors of each of these essays that are now found in that book that you can purchase. I actually just picked my own copy up last week from Siegel Books out here in Utah. His latest episode is a interview with Larry Morris. He's a staff member of the LDS Church History Department, and he was the author of the essay on Doctrine and Covenants 17, which was titled The Experience of the Three Witnesses. This episode clocks in at just under a half hour, so it's a quick listen, and it's well produced. It's packed full of great information. It's really worth the listen.
Another great podcast from LDS Perspectives looks into Brigham Young, George Watts, Pittman Shorthand, and the Journal of Discourses. In part one, Russell Stevenson talks with Garrett Dirkmaat, assistant professor of church history and doctrine at Brigham Young University, about the research he and LeJean Carruth did in comparing the shorthand notes of George Watts to the speeches in the Journal of Discourses. In part two, Laura Harris Hales talks with LeJean about her unique skill of reading Pittman shorthand, which is the shorthand that was used by George Watts in transcribing the speeches, his style, and the speaking style of early religious leaders. This was a fascinating interview, and I have a feeling we're going to be hearing a lot more in the near future about Pittman shorthand, Brigham Young, and the speeches in mid-1800s Utah. But I think the best part about this interview was really some of the detail that they go into, talking about the differences between the Pittman shorthand transcription and the actual physical Journal of Discourses books, and the differences. And there are some significant differences in tone and sometimes in content, both in additions to the Pittman shorthand and in retractions from the shorthand.
Now, Brandt, if you don't know LeJean Carruth, she is probably one of the coolest people in the world, and she is one of really the last historians that knows Pittman shorthand and can teach Pittman shorthand. So a lot of church historians go to her to be instructed in how to transcribe Pittman shorthand. It would be a shame if we lost the ability to translate Pittman shorthand, because so much of 19th century text was written in that style. And she's always happy to share. She's a very well-spoken lady. You know, it's funny because she's so quiet, and then you hear her on an interview with Laura Hales, and and she's just so eloquent in her speech. And I talked to Laura a little bit about this episode, and Laura said, I asked her if LeJean was reading from a script, and Laura said, nope, not at all. That was all off the top of her head.
Are you kidding me?
No,
I could have sworn that she had maybe written it out and was reading. That was all. Wow. I wish I could be that well spoken.
Right. Because Laura was sitting in the same room with her at the time that they did the recording. They do all their recordings live, and amazing, right? Mm-hmm. Such clarity. An interesting conference recently took place at Utah State University titled New Perspectives on Joseph Smith and Revelation. This conference was hosted by a new organization that's going by the name Faith Matters, and was organized by Dr. Phil Barlow, who is the chair of the history department at Utah State University and also the Mormon Studies chair. Panelists in this conference included Jared Hickman, Samuel Brown, Jana Reese, Richard Bushman, Terrell Givens, and Rosalind Welch.
Wow.
Yeah. So I attended this conference, Brandt, and let me tell you, it was packed. This thing was standing room only, and it was insanely intellectual. Can I just put it mildly?
Man.
I was lost through half of the presentations. Jared Hickman and Sam Brown and Rosalind Welch are some of the, and of course, it goes without saying, Bushman, Givens, Reese. These are some of the intellectual giants in Mormon studies right now. And really, they are getting together to discuss let's just say in a very ivory tower sort of way at this point, different ways of looking at the translation process that Joseph Smith used, not just for the Book of Mormon, but also for the Book of Abraham, and just the whole concept of translation itself, looking at many different ways of kind of deciphering this, chewing it apart, and coming up with some new views that I think will eventually filter down into something that's a little bit more broadly applicable to a general audience. Now, I did talk to Dr. Barlow at this conference, and they did record the entire thing, and they had recorded with some very nice equipment. They are planning on editing this down and making it into a video that will be available online. They do want to promote this to a broad public. So, but those who would like to get a sneak peek into the topics discussed, Dan Witherspoon, who is also part of the Faith Matters organization, released an episode on his Mormon Matters podcast with Richard Bushman, Sam Brown, and Phil Barlow, where they teased some of the new perspectives that they're chewing on. It may be one of those game-changing moments in Mormon studies. Definitely check out the episode that Dan posted, and of course, we'll keep you up to date when the conference video becomes available.
And just one quick addition. I really hope that more people do what Utah State University is doing, what Utah Valley University does with some of their conferences, and make it available online, mostly because I would love to be out there for most of this stuff. It's tough to get out there, but if you're going to open it up to the public where they can attend really without cost or with a nominal cost, then if you start putting it online, then you start opening up to getting more people interested. And I've even talked to my wife about planning vacations around some of these conferences because that's how much of a nerd I am. So that's where it's like, yeah, if they do that again next year, yeah, then I'm totally going to be there. Blair Hodges at the Maxwell Institute podcast interviewed Jennifer Reeder and Kate Holbrook, editors of At the Pulpit, 185 Years of Discourses by Latter-day Saint Women, published by the Church Historians Press. Blair is a great interviewer. He's a friend of the show, and this episode really is a must listen.
Absolutely. Love what Blair's doing over there. All right, let's talk about some book releases for the month. So before we get into book releases, I just want to make a plug for Devery Anderson. He's a friend of the show. He's been he's well loved in Mormon history circles. Well, he's published several books on the topic of Mormonism, but people don't realize that he also publishes outside of Mormonism. And in fact, recently published a very well-received biography of Emmett Till, who that was, for those who aren't as familiar with that history, he was really one of the sparks of the civil rights movements. He was killed by some white supremacists down south, and the news went nationwide and really kickstarted what became the civil rights movement. So he did probably the most comprehensive biography of Emmett Till. In fact, it's been so well received that even HBO picked it up as a 6-part series. Well, he's at it again. He wants to write another book, this time on Mississippi Freedom Summer Project. For those not familiar with that history, it was a drive to get as many African Americans registered to vote as possible in Mississippi in the 1960s during the civil rights movement. And it turned into violent outbreaks. So again, this is another one of those chinks in the fence of what turned into the civil rights movement. He's going to do a phenomenal job on this if he can get this project done. But, despite the fact that he has this HBO series coming out, despite the fact that he's sold, a ton of books of Emmett Till, and he's also sold books within Mormon studies, he's not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, and he's putting out a Kickstarter project to help him get this book done. The biggest thing is to be able to afford to fly out to interview folks who are still alive, who were involved in the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project. They're getting in their 90s now, and so we're going to miss our opportunity to get their voices recorded, so that they can actually be part of this book, as opposed to just going by documentary sources.
And Devery, his body of work stands for itself. He is great at what he does, and even I really didn't know that much about Emmett Till until I started following some of the stuff he was doing on social media. He really does throw everything into this, so this is a great, worthwhile cause. Yeah.
So we'll link to that Kickstarter project in the show notes. Definitely go in there, donate a few bucks if you can. I mean, I went in there and donated $25 because that's what I had, and he appreciates each and every dollar that we can spend.
Mm-hmm. Another book that came out is by Patrick Q. Mason, titled What is Mormonism? A Student's Introduction, published by Routledge. This short and lively book covers Mormonism's history, core beliefs, rituals, and devotion practices, as well as the impact on the daily lives of its followers. The book focuses on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Salt Lake City-based church that is the largest and best-known expression of Mormonism, while also exploring lesser-known churches that claim descent from Smith's original revelations. This book is designed for undergraduate religious studies and history students. What is Mormonism provides a reliable and easily digestible introduction to a steady, growing religion that continues to befuddle even learned observers of American religion and culture.
Yeah, so I'm happy to see that there's another university press, Routledge, that's getting more actively involved in Mormon studies. Again, just like we are getting more chairs in Mormon studies, we're getting more universities that are interested in publishing works about Mormonism. I also enjoy that Patrick included some of the other denominations which claim lineage from Joseph Smith in this, and didn't just focus on the Utah church. So good for Patrick. And man, I mean, he's getting quite a publishing repartee over there, isn't he?
Yeah, and he really is one of those guys that if he's publishing or writing something, I'm going to drop everything and listen.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard E. Turley, Janice L. Johnson, and Legene Purcell Caruth published Mountain Meadows Massacre, Collected Legal Papers. This is being published through the University of Oklahoma Press, another university player in Mormon studies. On September 11th, 1857, a group of Mormons aided by Paiute Indians brutally massacred some 120 men, women, and children traveling through the remote region of southwestern Utah. Within weeks, news of that atrocity spread across the United States, but it took until 1874, nearly 20 years later, before a grand jury finally issued indictments against 9 of the perpetrators. Mountain Meadows Massacre chronicles the prolonged legal battle to gain justice for the victims. The editors of this 2-volume collection combed public and private manuscript collections across the United States to reconstruct the complex legal proceedings that occurred in the massacre's aftermath. The documents they unearthed, transcribed, and presented here cover a nearly 40-year history of investigation and prosecution, from the first reports of the massacre in 1857 to the dismissal and the last indictment against the perpetrator in 1896. Volume 1 tells the first half of the story, the records of the investigations into the massacre and the transcriptions of all 9 indictments, 8 of which have never resulted in a trial conviction. Volume 2 details the legal proceedings against the one man indicted to go to trial, John D. Lee. Lee's trials led to his confession and his conviction, and ultimately to his execution on the massacre site in 1877, all documented in Volume 2.
Yeah, this is a massive undertaking. I can't imagine the amount of work it took to get all this data and all these legal records, and I'm really impressed that they're going to put it all out there. Then again, this is also primary source documentation, which might only apply to a small subset of people, but it's out there.
Yeah, well, Richard Turley and Ron Walker and Glenn Leonard, they published the more, I guess you'd say, general history on Mountain Meadows Massacre at Mountain Meadows by Oxford University Press in 2008. So this is really a follow-up to that from the same collection of papers that they looked at, all from the church, mostly from the church archives, I should say, stuff that that earlier writers on the massacre didn't have access to. So this is, for a lot of this information, this is the first time, particularly the transcriptions of these legal documents, this is the first time that these have been published. So for researchers, this is gold.
And finally, rounding out our book releases, Dime Novel Mormons by Greg Kofford Books, which, Brian, I have to say, I'm disappointed. I thought the book was going to be a dime, but apparently it's not.
I'm so glad that you told that joke. I was waiting for somebody. To say, how come it's not a dime? And nobody, so far, nobody has. So, but
well, I had another joke about dimes, but I don't know if it'd be appropriate for a podcast. Dime novels were one of the most influential types of books in 19th century America, both for their relative cheapness and exciting content. So it's really hard to tell just how many of those dime novels featured Mormons, but the way Mormons were portrayed in dime novels was remarkably consistent over many decades and multiple genres. This consistency tells us that dime novelists were playing with common stereotypes that nearly all their readers recognized. Indeed, these stereotypes worked their way into much of the more respectable literature of the day and influenced the way American culture has interacted with Mormonism ever since. These tropes were based on 3 things, perhaps the only 3 things that most Americans knew about Mormons in the final decades of the 19th century: Danites, polygamy, and the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Wow, that's the big 3. Whatever variation occurs in the dime novels comes from mixing these 3 ingredients into new concoctions. For this volume, 4 full-length dime novels have been chosen to represent different aspects of the Mormon image in dime novels: Eagle Plume, The White Avenger, A Tale of the Mormon Trail, which was published in 1870, The Doomed Dozen, or Dolores, the Danite's Daughter, published in 1881, Frank Merriwell Among the Mormons, or The Last Tribes of Israel, published in 1897, and The Brady's Among the Mormons, or Secret Work in Salt Lake City, 1903. The often lurid and scandalous portrayals of Mormons in these dime novels had consequences for the relationships between Mormons and the rest of the United States. They would represent reality for millions of people, and the basic portrayals found their way into more serious literature. You know what, Brian? I'm basically sold on just the titles of those dime novels to begin with.
I know, right? This really is a collection of primary source documents. It's fictional literature, but it's primary source documents in the sense that historians can use this stuff to understand what the public perception of Mormons was at the time. And so it's incredibly useful, but it's also at the same time incredibly fun, trashy reading. So,
it's interesting. I guess I'd never thought about it in the sense of, this could be primary source documents, because you're tapping into you're probably tapping into, like I was saying, the stereotypes of the way that people viewed Mormons. So that's a good way of seeing that. I guess I think of primary source documents in the more traditional sense, and not viewing this as the primary source documents.
Right. Most people think of primary sources as letters that have been written, or correspondence of some sort, or meeting minutes, or journal keeping and things of that nature. But I mean, this is a primary source document in the fact that they are published contemporary to the time, right? So you have books that are being published about Mormons and polygamy while Mormons were still practicing polygamy, or shortly after Mormons publicly disavowed plural marriage. You've got the trial of John D. Lee very much in the public consciousness at the time that people are writing about the Mountain Meadows massacre. So, one of the things that I notice in this is you have the tropes that are standard for any outsider group, and that is, number one, secrecy, number two, violence, and number three, sexual deviancy. Yep. And we've applied those same tropes to just about any group that we disagree with, or that we don't want to come in the United States, whether it be the Chinese, Japanese, Jewish communities, Catholics. They've all received the same treatment of the same three tropes.
Middle Eastern, if you're thinking in more recent times.
So, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think that these books are actually incredible. I think the whole series is actually incredibly useful for scholarly research and for expanding, what we see as primary source material. A new section that we added in for this podcast here is papers, and once in a while, a paper will come up on my radar as being particularly buzzworthy within the Mormon scholarly community. I would love to be able to dissect every journal that comes out and be able to talk about every paper in every journal that comes out, but obviously that would make for a 4-hour-long show that would be a snore fest. So we thought we'd highlight a few papers here and there, and in particular, papers that Mormon historians have uploaded to places like academia.edu, where it's accessible for you to download and be able to read without necessarily having to subscribe to those journals, which can be rather expensive. So, so let's go ahead and kick this off, Brandt.
So speaking of academia.edu, and like Brian was saying, they're really an awesome treasure trove of just like poking around and seeing what's there. But because there's so many papers out there, you've got to separate yourself from the pack. So how do you do that? Like we talked earlier, you've got to have a killer title, like Stephen Taysom. Satan mourns naked upon the earth, locating Mormon possession and exorcism rituals in the American religious landscape, 1830 through 1977.
Wow.
which by the way, if you're like just browsing through there, that's going to make you stop.
Yeah.
And that can be found in volume 1.
Satan, naked, exorcism, possession, Mormon. That's got all the buzzwords.
Yeah, you're talking about the big three of violence, sex, and secrecy. There you go. It's got two of the three. And this can be found in the Volume 1, Winter 2017 journal, Religion and American Culture, a Journal of Interpretation. To quote from Tayson's introduction, this article looks beyond the official invisibility of possession and exorcism and explores how Mormons in different times and places translated their beliefs into ritual action. This is not an attempt to excavate the causes of possession. The article has one overriding goal: to situate Mormon belief and ritual practice dealing with possession and exorcism within a larger context of American culture and religion. Instances of possession and exorcism function for Mormons as performances that can accomplish a wide variety of cultural and religious goals, from supporting Mormon truth claims to providing an avenue for women to express themselves, to expressing late 20th century Mormon attitudes about the sacredness of hierarchy. Finally, I argue that exorcism accounts reveal in fine-grained detail the constant engagement with and adaptation to larger religious and cultural forces and work in the American context. Stephen's a great writer. He's a great researcher, and this really was fun to read.
So Stephen has been working on this for a long time, and he's presented a few things here and there in groups. He was one of the presenters at the Neal A. Maxwell Institute summer seminar a few years back, and I got to listen to him talk about some of this paper at that time. And he wasn't really focused on trying to prove whether or not these people were really possessed by demons, but rather kind of the social impacts of exorcism within Mormonism. Another paper that's been getting some buzz in historical circles is William Davis's Reassessing Joseph Smith Jr.'s Formal Education. This was printed in the winter 2016 issue of Dialogue. In the opening of the article, Davis wrote, "The amount of Smith's formal education, or rather the various assumptions surrounding his presumed lack of it, has been enlisted by followers and detractors alike in order to frame Smith's life within the narrative of divinely inspired prophet or deceptive fraud, perhaps most acutely in the context of attacking or defending the origin and authenticity of the Book of Mormon." Davis went on to analyze the role of education in the Smith family home, as well as some of the more commonly known statements regarding Joseph's limited education and abilities. He then traced, and this is really the power of his article, Joseph's education year by year, beginning in 1809 when Joseph was 4, until 1826 when Joseph was 20. So 16 years of Joseph's year-by-year education. In the end, Davis stated that it was really difficult to arrive at a specific number of years that Joseph was formally educated because when he looked at it, he had a lot of opportunities, but it wasn't really clear whether or not he took those opportunities. He added up at the end, accumulated about 10 and a half years worth of opportunity to receive an education, out of which we can only confidently state that he took about 4 years worth, or actually it's 4 terms of education. So however you define that, 4 semesters. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's all that he had. So what he concluded in the end was that Joseph's education, he's confident, is higher than what we traditionally acknowledge.
Yeah, which is an interesting wrinkle to put on the Joseph Smith story. I know some traditional believers, it is a strong part of their faith that an uneducated person like Joseph Smith was able to do all that he was able to do. I know other people take that for a different context. But I think as we start going forward, probably what's going to happen is we're going to be reevaluating some of this stuff. And really, as people do better research, the big question is going to be, how will that research be interpreted and integrated? Are we going to stick with traditional narrative stories, or are we going to be open to different ways of viewing history?
Yeah. And one of the things that Davis said that I appreciated in his article was that clearly what he did see in Joseph was a desire for education and a desire for self-improvement that really carries over into the Mormon tradition. So, there is a new way to frame this, that it isn't necessarily a bad thing if Joseph Smith received more education than we've believed for a long time.
Right. Moving on to events. One of my favorite events of the year is taking place at Utah Valley University, and it's literally happening while we record. The UVU Mormons. What's that?
I said right at this moment.
Right at this moment. Right now. The UVU Mormon Studies Conference began on March 29th and will run through March 31st. The theme of this conference is Multicultural Mormonism, Religious Cohesion in a New Era of Diversity. From their website, this conference will explore multicultural and intercultural interactions within Mormonism, focusing on issues surrounding ethnicity, race, and class, and with an eye toward the future of Mormonism as a global religion. They are doing a live stream on YouTube, so you will be able to find it there if you can't make it in person. And I'm hoping this means that the archives will be available on YouTube after they're done, mostly because I've got a day job and I can't just be watching YouTube all day.
Yeah, from what I understand, I think they will be that they will stay up. They've done a pretty good job of that in the past. Now, one of their keynote speakers from today was Gina Colvin, and we spoke about her before with her Thoughtful Faith podcast. She's also one of the bloggers for Kiwi Mormon. But I mean, if you want to talk about somebody who understands the issues surrounding multicultural Mormonism and religious cohesion in this new era of diversity, Gina Colvin is the epitome of that. She's from New Zealand. She teaches at is it Auckland University?
I think so. Yeah,
I believe. And she is a cultural sociologist, essentially. Yeah. So, I mean, this is really her field. And from what I understand, I didn't get a chance to watch it today. I was busy working as well. But from what I understand, she really just hit it out of the park today. So I'm looking forward to viewing that. Our friends over at Book of Mormon Central recently hosted their first Book of Mormon conference at the Utah Valley Convention Center. This event absorbed the former annual Book of Mormon Archaeological Foundation conference that was going on for years and years. So for those who are interested in Book of Mormon archaeology and Near Eastern studies, this was really the cargo pants and safari hats nerd gathering of the year. I spoke with Neil Rapalai over at the Book of Mormon Central, and he assured me that videos of the presentations are already being edited for public release very soon. And, I do have to hand it to those guys over at Book of Mormon Central. They are video nuts. They love putting out video on this stuff. They do a great job of editing those videos and of making them very polished and professional and enjoyable to watch. So I look forward to seeing some of the stuff that comes out of this. Even if I'm not somebody who wears a lot of cargo pants and safari hats, I think I'll still get a lot of greatness out of this.
And we talk so much about the internet really opening up the wide variety and opportunity for people to really research Mormonism. One of the more interesting things that's happening is people are starting to jump on the video bandwagon a lot more so that these things are more available. And I'm really glad that Book of Mormon Central is doing it. I'm glad that UVU is doing it. I'm glad that Utah State's doing it because it can be nothing but a good thing that more of this information is getting out there. And specifically, I will say that quality scholarly information is getting out there versus basically someone like me that's just staring into a webcam wanting to pontificate about whatever. The Mormon Transhumanist Association will be having their annual conference on Saturday, April 8th at the Utah Valley Convention Center with the theme of Evolving Gods. Speakers include biologist and your friend and mine, Stephen Peck, conservationist George Hanley, futurist Robin Hanson, and tech and social entrepreneur Michelle Glauser. You can find the link in the show notes for registration details.
They also do everything on YouTube as well, or put all their conferences up on YouTube. So another great example of conferences making themselves accessible to a wider audience. The 2017 Mormon History Association Conference is coming up very quickly in June. This year's conference is going to be held in St. Louis, Missouri, and it's going to be exploring the theme of crossing and dwelling. Highlights from this year's program include scholarly discussions on the church's gospel topics essays. And on that panel, we've got Steve Taysom, who we just discussed. Also, David Howlett with the Community of Christ is going to be on that panel discussing the LDS Church's gospel topics essays. A number of other well-known scholars. There's going to be an interesting paper. I just went through and looked at some highlights. Danny Jorgensen, who's also a Community of Christ historian, is going to be talking about the taint of plural marriage on the Cutlerite tradition. And there's going to be a discussion from Paul Reeve on the Circleville Massacre. Not a lot of people are familiar with that topic. A plenary address by Mike Quinn, and a lunch address the next day by Elder Stephen Snow. This is kind of the big deal of Mormon history conferences, but you do need to be a current Mormon History Association member in order to be able to attend. You can click the link in the show notes. I'll be there. Greg Kofford Books is sending me out. So if you happen to be there, come by our table and shake hands with me. Tell me what a big dork I am and buy some of our books.
Speaking of a group that really needs to get on the YouTube and podcast bandwagon, Mormon History Association, because I'd love to see some of that stuff, but I won't make it out there. To be fair though, I mean, we are talking about a bunch of historians who are still in denial that digital books even exist. That's true.
So,
that's true.
It's to ask them to put stuff online. It's going to take 100 years before they adapt to that kind of technology. Anyway, a little bit of ribbing from a fellow historian for my fellow historians.
From the In Case You Missed It file, on March 1st, 2017, Kate Holbrook was at Benchmark Books to speak about her book, At the Pulpit, 185 Years of Discourses by Latter-day Saint Women, published by the Church Historians Press. Co-editor Jenny Reeder was unable to be in the attendance. Following her remarks, she took questions from the audience, and the video is now available on YouTube, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes.
Benchmark always does a great job of putting their events online. So check them out. They've got, if you just go to their page, you'll see all sorts of fantastic recorded events. Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, for instance, Greg Prince, you'll find all sorts of great stuff. Yeah. So moving into our last section, call for papers. The Neil A. Maxwell Institute Summer Seminar has announced its 2017 program. The theme this year is Mormonism Confronts the World, how the LDS Church has responded to developments in science, culture, and religion. The seminar will be held on the BYU campus in Provo, Utah from June 26th to August 3rd, 2017. And this year's seminar is going to be co-directed by Terrell Givens and by Phil Barlow. This is kind of one of those annual seminars that goes on that's like, that you've arrived in the field of Mormon studies if you get accepted to come into the seminar. This is one of those seminars where careers get made. Yeah,
and I've actually loved going through and seeing some of the papers that they've published in the past, and they're stellar. And I have nothing but good things to say about what they do there. And especially you look at some of the people involved, Terrell Givens, Philip Barlow. I know that Richard Bushman's been involved in the past. These are, like you said, these aren't lightweights.
Yeah.
And finally, this month, Surveying Trends in the Field, Mormon History and Mormon Studies in the Modern Academy will be held Thursday, June 1st at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. There will be no cost for the workshop beyond punctual arrival and rigorous intellectual engagement. Any graduate student or early career scholar that is interested in Mormon studies in any discipline may apply. Women and less represented groups are especially encouraged to apply. The paper you propose to present must touch on Mormonism in some way. Preference will be given to papers that examine gender, race, sexuality, the 20th century, or global Mormonism. You must be physically present at the Danforth Center to participate, and you can find more details at the link in the show notes.
So this is in conjunction with the Mormon History Association conference out there. I think that's why they chose the date that they did. This is pretty much the first night or the day before, I believe, the Mormon History Association conference. So they're there's ostensibly going to be quite a few people out there already, perhaps people who didn't get their paper in time to the Mormon History Association, or for whatever reason weren't able to be put on the speaking schedule at the main conference. This would be a really good opportunity for you to get your paper read and in front of some other like-minded scholars. And that wraps us up for this month. Like I said, this was a full action-packed episode.
Wow, I'm exhausted.
It's time for us old men to go take a nap. Mm-hmm. But we'll see you next month, Brandt. It was great having you.
Thank you very much, Brian. It was fun. And let's do this again next month.
Let's do it again.